A few more years of this and we'll be a failed state. If we continue with the gross corruption and incompetence of Johnson's government and other governments like it, we're going to end up flipping from being a largely prosperous and stable nation into a nation in total economic, political and social chaos. We're complacent about this because we imagine it can't happen to us. You know, it's been so many years we've had a vast flow of money pouring through the United Kingdom, often seized effectively from the rest of the world. And we think, well, this is the way it's always going to be. But it doesn't necessarily stay that way. If you have gross misrule for long enough, then that misrule will turn your nation into a failed state. There's something I call the pollution paradox that works like this. It's that the most antisocial companies, the dirtiest ones, the ones which damage our health, the ones which design exotic financial instruments, which are most damaging to society, have the greatest incentive to pour money into politics. And that's because if they didn't pour money into politics, they would be regulated out of existence. Democracy wouldn't put up with them. So they have to override democracy by spending money. And the result of that is that politics then comes to be dominated by the dirtiest and most antisocial companies. So that the whole political structure begins to shift in their direction, shift away from the more sociable ones towards the antisocial ones. That's the pollution paradox. And what we have in power in the United Kingdom now is a government which owes its existence to the pollution paradox. It's a government of dirty money. And it's the most antisocial commercial interests which have paid effectively for Boris Johnson to become Prime Minister through pouring their money into his political campaigns. They include, for instance, the property developers who want to sweep away our planning laws, the pesticide manufacturers who want to do away with the regulations preventing them from killing bees and many other life forms, the people who want to privatise the NHS, and already we've seen with the pandemic huge numbers of NHS functions being handed to Boris Johnson's cronies, some of whom turn out to be Tory party funders. The banks who want to get back to developing really dangerous products which make them a huge amount of money in a short amount of time. We see the very companies who we should effectively be regulating out of existence because they are damaging our lives, coming to dominate our political lives instead through a Prime Minister who is effectively being created by them. And of course, at the top of that tree, stitching together all those dirty money interests, are the media barons. Rupert Murdoch, the Bartley brothers, or the one remaining Bartley brother, Lord Rothermere, the proprietor of the Daily Mail. These are the people who effectively keep Boris Johnson afloat. Without them, without the relentless propaganda of the billionaire press, Johnson wouldn't last 5 minutes in politics. He would never have become Mayor of London. He would never have become Foreign Secretary. He would never, above all, have become Prime Minister. This guy's an inveterate liar. Everyone knows he's an inveterate liar. He's a charlatan. He's a fraud. In a system not dominated by dirty money, not dominated by the media barons, how could he possibly have survived and prospered? It's only through them that he can govern. He doesn't govern in his own right. He's effectively Rupert Murdoch's viceroy. And of course, it's completely unsurprising that there's payback here. You invest £1 million in politics, you get £1 billion back. It's one of the most lucrative investments you can possibly make. You look at these companies who have got coronavirus contracts for protective equipment, or contracts for running test and trace, or contracts now for distributing the vaccine. Some of these companies are making money hand over fist, not even delivering the products or the services which they're being paid to deliver. And they're making that money because they were given the contracts without competitive tender, without advertising. Some of them don't even have any background in the field for which they've been given these contracts. They're completely incompetent. They're totally useless at it. But they're really good at making money from the government, which is giving them that money. And some of them, as Tory donors, might have given a few tens of thousands to the government. They are reaping hundreds of millions of pounds in untendered contracts from that same government. Rupert Murdoch supports Boris Johnson's bid for power, and in return he gets the media deregulated so he can set up his own broadcasting outfit. These paybacks are enormous. You put a small amount in, you get a huge amount back out. But above those immediate results, you get something much deeper than that. You get an entire political environment that favours your interests, that favours dirty money over clean money, that favours money over people, that favours plutocracy over democracy. One of the most extraordinary phenomena of our time is that in the midst of the chaos of the government's mishandling of the pandemic, which has meant that at times we've had the highest death rates on earth, we see the Tory party's polling holding firm, 40% or so. How could this possibly be? We've been let down, betrayed, worse than any government has done in this country, arguably since the First World War, by a complete, callous, corrupt, self-interested, incompetent government. And yet still people are inclined to vote for the people who have been killing them. Well, why? Why is this happening? It's happening solely because of the relentless propaganda in the billionaire press, constantly reframing what's happening, constantly painting Boris Johnson, perhaps the most incompetent Prime Minister we've had for at least a century, as our saviour, as this man who's come on clouds of glory to lift us out of the slough of despond. And yet what he's done is to combine the disaster of the coronavirus with the disaster of Brexit and dump us in this nightmare from which, well, it's going to take years to emerge. And yet somehow people want to vote for him. Well, that's because of the way their perceptions have been fundamentally distorted by the press. The way in which we are told that one thing is quite another. The way in which we are told that the people who have been damaging our lives have actually been protecting us. We see this systemic lying becoming an art form within the billionaire press and changing the political nature of this country. And what this does is to create the most dangerous thing in politics, which is impunity. It doesn't matter what the government does, they get away with it. It doesn't matter how many people die. It doesn't matter how many people are going to suffer from long COVID. It doesn't matter how much economic devastation there's been caused by the government's failure to get a grip on this early on, set up a good test and trace system, set up a good quarantine system, totally failed to do that, and so we have endless lockdowns instead. But none of that matters. It doesn't matter because you sustain the support of Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere and the Bartley brother. You've still got them behind you, and so you can get away with anything. And that is the most dangerous situation you can have politically, because it means that there are no brakes. There's no restraint on what a government might do, and that's how you end up with an elective dictatorship. So you might have thought this is a perfect opportunity for Labour to move in and say, look, these people, this bunch of charlatans and liars, are only going to lead us into further disaster. Here we are with a new narrative of politics that's going to push plutocracy to one side and put democracy centre stage again, as it should be. But instead, we see Labour effectively buttoning its lip, saying almost nothing, making a few criticisms of government policy, but not articulating a clear alternative. Without that alternative, people lose hope. And Labour are saying, well, we've got to keep our powder dry. The election is 3 or 4 years off. If we tell people what we stand for before then, The Tories will just rip that down. No, sorry, we're in the midst of a national crisis, a huge national disaster, bigger than any we've had for a very long time. You've got to stand up and say, not just that this is wrong, not just that the government has screwed it up, but here is what we should be doing instead. Here is the alternative vision. Here is how we can rebuild this nation into something completely different. And of course, at the same time, there's this massive opportunity because half the economy now depends on government spending. So that gives us an opportunity fundamentally to change that economy, to move it away from fossil fuels, to move it away from exploitation, to move it away from ruthlessness into a green, caring economy which doesn't depend on endless growth, which doesn't depend on extraction of natural resources, which doesn't depend on exploiting workers, a completely different basis for the economy. And we can do that now in a way that might not have been possible before because that economy depends on government policy. And we have a government which just wants to get back to how things were before. Normal, they call it. How was it normal? How is it normal to have an economy in which a few billionaires reap most of the gains of economic growth while people at the bottom become poorer and poorer, even while on paper the country becomes richer? How is it normal to be sacrificing the lives of future generations for the apparent prosperity of current generations? How is it normal to be destroying our life support systems in the name of economic growth? We need a completely different economy, and we have a golden opportunity to create that economy now, but Labour is not standing up and articulating it. And by the time the election comes around, well, who knows? The opportunity might not be there at all. So it has to happen now. There's never been a better time to stand up and put forward a strong alternative. And it frustrates me to see Keir Starmer just dithering almost as badly as Boris Johnson dithers. The only opportunities we ever get for sweeping political change are in the wake of a major crisis. After the Second World War, for example, there was a massive crisis and we ended up with massive political change arising from that because Clement Attlee was able to step forward and say, we need to rebuild this nation on new lines. And he did that very effectively. Then we had another massive crisis in 2008 with the financial crisis. And there was a golden opportunity there for Labour to say, look, a terrible thing has happened. To stop this from happening again, we need to rebuild this nation on different lines. But it failed to do that. It just tried to get things back to the way they were before, the disastrous way that they were before. And now it's happening again. Here we are in the midst of an enormous crisis, greater than any since the Second World War. And Labour is completely failing to step forward and say, now is our moment to change things, to change almost everything, which we desperately need to do when we're in the midst of an unsustainable economy, which is pushing us towards an even greater crisis than the coronavirus, which is climate breakdown and ecological breakdown. When we have a situation in which, despite the enormous wealth flushing through our economy, huge numbers of people can scarcely make ends meet, would be starving if it were not for food banks. Just extraordinary that we've allowed this to happen. And far from standing up and articulating that alternative, Labour is effectively nodding along with the outrageous system that we have normalised, suggesting a few tweaks, but not suggesting systemic change, which is what we currently need. So this is a time for effective citizens' politics. This is a time for us to come together and demand that alternative. Demand the economic alternative. Demand the political alternative, rather than this highly centralised system where we get one choice every 4 or 5 years and then we're told, well, you made your choice, so now we, the government, can do what we want. Demand a system which allows us to have a much greater say in politics day to day, where we have participatory democracy alongside representative democracy, and where representative democracy is also radically changed. So instead of the Prime Minister having almost sovereign powers and Parliament being effectively kept out of the loop, we actually have a representative democracy which genuinely listens to people and responds to people. And that's got to start with proportional representation and with getting the money out of politics. We've just got to stop politics being polluted by big money, which turns democracy into plutocracy. And we have got to come together and fill that vacuum which Labour has completely failed to fill. Politics abhors a vacuum. There are massive opportunities for people to put forward an exciting, thrilling vision of how our nation should be, of what its economy should be like, of what its politics should be like, of what its social and cultural life should be like. We could change everything. We've got that scope now, that opportunity to change everything. We have to take it. There are three nations which have really stood out in terms of their total incompetence in dealing with this pandemic. They're the UK, the US and Brazil. And in all cases, we've seen that incompetence arising from governments which are hard right to far right. Governments which really don't give a stuff about their people because they're totally detached from the interests of those people and connected very strongly to the interests of money. What we always see with a hard right or a far right government is effectively a racket. They might have populist demagogic positions, but actually what they do is to represent the interests of money, and generally the dirtiest and most antisocial money that there is. And that is the defining characteristic of the Johnson government, Donald Trump's government, now thankfully over, and Jair Bolsonaro's government in Brazil. And because of that, because that is their fundamental defining characteristic, they've all failed to get a grip on the pandemic, to set up effective systems like an effective test, trace, isolate and support system, which is absolutely essential for preventing the spread of this virus, and instead have delivered the worst of both worlds, an effectively unchecked pandemic coupled with social and economic disaster of repeated lockdowns and endless restrictions. It's the worst of both worlds created by governments which were not put there in the interests of the people, but were put there in the interests of big money. So the whole pitch that this government made before the election was, we need Brexit because of all these immigrants coming over here, all these people coming into our country, bringing their diseases, bringing their foreignness into Britain, and we need to shut them out. And they claimed that was what Brexit was really about. Of course, it wasn't about that. It was about something completely different. It was about the civil war within capitalism. But that was the whole way they sold it to us. It is all about those people coming into the country, and we've got to stop that. Then coronavirus comes along with a genuine risk of disease coming into this country brought in by travellers. And what does the government do? Nothing. Nothing. In the first months of the disease, 18 million journeys, 18 million travellers came into this country, and only 273 of those people had to go into quarantine. Just an extraordinary situation. It's only now, almost a year into the pandemic, that they start imposing some quarantine half measures, which aren't nearly sufficient to prevent reinfection from coming into this nation. So on the one hand, they say it's all about keeping foreigners out. And yeah, for them, it's about keeping foreigners out. If those foreigners basically are poor and brown, we're going to keep them out. But, you know, business travellers, people going to their second homes in Tuscany, people coming here to work in the city of London, whatever it might be. Oh, yeah, just let them in and let's have no restrictions, even when we are in the midst of a pandemic. The irony is overwhelming. We have the worst people in charge at the worst possible moment. This is a government which has arisen out of the apparatus of persuasion created by dirty money, out of the billionaire press. And of course, you know, Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, was a journalist working for the billionaire press. That's how he established himself, working, in this case, for the Bartley brothers at the Telegraph. We have Downing Street and other government agencies populated, swarming with people from the dark money lobby groups, these groups that call themselves think tanks, refuse to reveal where their funding comes from. When we find out, it turns out that it's from billionaires, it's from tobacco companies, it's from oil companies. But in the media, they pose as independent thinkers. Yes? And we just think that actually it's a good idea not to regulate tobacco. And we think that actually renewable energy is bad. And we think that actually climate science is a crock. You know, they just happen to have come across these thoughts which happen to align with the interests of their funders. Well, now those people are in government. In fact, to some extent, they are the government. And this combination is the worst possible combination when you need a government that cares about its people, that wants to stop a national catastrophe from unfolding. Because this lot don't care. They're totally callous. That's why they got into the positions they're in. That's why they've been backed by billionaires in the first place, because they don't care about what happens to the people. They care about doing their funders' bidding, which is making a better world for billionaires and a worse world for everybody else. Societies are destroyed by oligarchs. The professor of social science, Kevin Mackay, has analysed the civilizations which have collapsed, and he says the common factor is extreme domination by oligarchs. That's why civilizations collapse, because you have a group of people whose interests are completely at variance with the rest of the population, but the rest of the population has got almost no say in the direction that society takes. And so those few people, the oligarchs, they drive that society into catastrophe. That's just what we're seeing today with Rupert Murdoch, with the other press owners, with the hedge funds, with the property developers, the people who've got a complete grip on this government because they created the government. They are the worst possible people to have in charge at a time of national crisis. Now, the government, with the help of the billionaire press, is very good at just brushing things under the carpet. But can you really brush 100,000 deaths under the carpet? Can you really brush under the carpet all the people with long COVID, all the people whose livelihoods have been completely destroyed by the government's failure to get a grip on the pandemic early on and to shut the virus down? Can you really just dismiss all that stuff and pretend it didn't happen? Well, maybe you can, but not if the people get a grip, not if the people come forward and say enough is enough. We're not putting up with this any longer. We've had enough of being treated like the dirt under your shoe. If this country is a democracy, then it should be run by the people and in the interests of the people, not by a few dirty corporations and in their interests. And we have to dethrone the money from politics. We have to put the people back in charge. We have to push out of politics the dirty money, the dirty interests, the cronyism, the corruption, the incompetence, the callousness which has come to govern political life at the moment. And this is our moment. This is the time when we can press for systemic change. But these moments don't come up very often. And horrible and disastrous as this has all been, we have to turn this crisis into an opportunity for change. Gross misrule is the other pandemic that we face. And it's spreading into every aspect of society. It's spreading into our public services, which are being privatised and broken up. It's spreading into our emergency response, which has been almost lacking. It's spreading into our impacts on the living world, which is collapsing before our very eyes. All the elements are there, potentially, for state failure. So we need a vaccine for this other pandemic. What is that vaccine? Us.